The autumn air was heavy with silence as mourners lowered Richard Foster into the earth. His empire, a monument to discipline and control, ended in marble and flowers. That evening, Daniel Foster wandered through the mansion that now belonged to him. The rooms echoed with power, but not warmth. Corridors filled with portraits of a man who valued legacy more than tenderness. In his father's study, behind oak shelves lined with dusty law books, Daniel found a drawer locked tight. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed with years, holding secrets no funeral could bury. A faded photograph showed a young black woman, weary but proud, cradling a pale infant. Below it, a name scrawled in trembling ink, Amara Foster, 1992. Alongside it were adoption papers stamped with cold authority. Daniel's hand shook as the truth whispered louder than any sermon that morning. Daniel had spent decades armored in wealth. Billion-dollar ventures bore his name, supercars lined his garages, and his calendar moved from boardroom to runway like clockwork. Yet in quiet moments before mirrors, all the money in the world could not still the question that had haunted him since boyhood. Whose blood runs in my veins? His reflection offered fragments, a jawline he never inherited, eyes unclaimed by anyone in his life. He would stare, razor poised in hand, seeing a face without context. His father's words still echoed, "Forget the past, she didn't want you." Daniel had tried, but the unanswered question grew sharper, cutting deeper with each success. In the mirror's silence, he realized no accolade could replace belonging. Now, holding the envelope, the reflection felt different. The mirror no longer mocked him. It demanded a reckoning he could no longer avoid.
The Foster estate was immaculate, an empire of trimmed hedges and polished floors where order left no room for tenderness. Daniel's childhood was shaped by schedules, tutors, and instructions about what a Foster must be. Richard Foster enforced discipline with precision, teaching his son that emotions were liabilities. Christmas mornings looked like catalog displays, gifts stacked high, but affection measured in nods. School performances ended with handshakes, not embraces. His adoptive mother, Catherine, hovered silently, her elegance hiding conflict. She wanted to comfort him, but never crossed Richard's rigid lines. In those years, Daniel learned early that wealth could buy structure, but it could not purchase warmth. He carried toys that broke easily, but not memories that held. The house raised him on success, but starved him of love. Now, the photograph in his hands revealed the warmth that had been stolen. Catherine Foster was refined, graceful, and tragically obedient to silence. She knew more than she ever admitted, carrying guilt like an accessory hidden beneath pearls. She arranged Daniel's birthdays with grandeur, but when he asked about his real parents, her eyes would cloud before Richard's voice cut the air with finality. Catherine feared confrontation more than heartbreak, so she chose quiet compliance. Yet in the stillness of night, she would often walk past Daniel's room, pausing at his door with an ache she never voiced. She loved him in her way, but fear kept her from speaking the truth. Every glance at Richard reminded her of promises broken, of truths buried for the sake of prestige. The envelope Daniel now held would not only expose his father's cruelty, but it would also indict her silence. The weight of withheld love pressed harder than wealth.
The name was there in black ink, Amara Foster, a young widow stripped of choices after tragedy. The adoption file read like a verdict: husband dead in an aviation accident, left with nothing but grief and an infant. The court declared her unfit, citing economic instability, as if poverty were a crime. Legal signatures sealed Daniel's fate, severing him from the woman who had given him life. The photograph, though faded, carried truth stronger than any stamp of approval. Amara's eyes were weary, yet they glimmered with love as she clutched her newborn. Daniel traced her image with trembling fingers, realizing she had never abandoned him. She had been forced into surrender. The file revealed not rejection, but coercion. For the first time, Daniel's fortune felt stained. His billions, his empire, his prestige, everything rested on a foundation of stolen sacrifice. The story Daniel had believed all his life crumbled like brittle glass. Richard's cold reassurances that his mother hadn't wanted him were lies crafted to protect the foster name. The reality was more brutal. His birth mother's love had been broken by poverty and power. Suddenly, his mansions felt hollow, his luxury cars like symbols of theft rather than triumph. He thought of his charitable donations, his public image as a philanthropist, and realized how shallow they were compared to the suffering one woman endured. His identity fractured, the ground beneath him unstable. The empire he built now looked like a tower erected on sand. His achievements no longer felt like victories, they felt like reminders of someone else's pain. In that moment, Daniel understood that his greatest pursuit was not business, but truth. Finding Amara was no longer optional. It was destiny.
The envelope lived on his desk, its contents refusing to stay silent. Nights became battlegrounds between exhaustion and obsession. Daniel wandered the mansion like a restless ghost, rooms echoing with wealth but empty of comfort. He studied Amara's photograph, her gaze haunting him more than any business rival ever could. He imagined her struggles, counting coins, skipping meals, facing each day with nothing but resilience. The image of her weighed heavier than his billion-dollar empire. He replayed every moment of his childhood under the Fosters' roof and realized how carefully love had been edited out. By dawn, sleep had abandoned him completely. Instead, he rose with a new purpose. He would not rest until he found her, not for closure, not for curiosity, but to give back what had been stolen from both of them: time, dignity, and truth. Determination hardened into action. Daniel turned to Jack Thompson, a private investigator with a reputation for relentless work. Money opened doors quickly: old court archives, faded hospital records, adoption files long forgotten. Yet even with resources, the trail was faint. Amara's name appeared in fragments: a job application here, a housing record there. Then, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into air, erased that poverty's cruel anonymity. Jack pursued every lead, asking questions in shelters, tracing addresses through dusty files, uncovering rumors of a woman who moved often, always working hard, always alone. Each clue painted Amara as a survivor, someone determined to endure even when the world offered nothing. Daniel waited anxiously, every phone call tightening his chest. The more he searched, the more he realized finding her would not be simple. Fate had hidden her well.
At last, hope surfaced. Jack discovered a woman matching Amara's description. She lived in a crumbling apartment on the edge of the city. Daniel's heart thundered as he authorized a DNA test, convinced the search had ended. For days, anticipation consumed him. He imagined the reunion, the conversations, the healing. But when the results arrived, they were cruel. The woman was not Amara. The truth was printed coldly, dismissing his hope with sterile certainty. Daniel felt crushed, his dreams collapsing in an instant. The city outside moved on, horns blared, people hurried, but inside, time stood still. He had come so close, only to face emptiness again. He wondered if his search was futile, if Amara was lost forever. Yet beneath despair, determination simmered. One failed lead would not silence his pursuit. His mother was out there, and he would not stop. Daniel began seeing his city with new eyes. From his penthouse balcony, he watched luxury towers cast shadows over streets lined with tents. Supercars roared past mothers carrying children with empty bags. He realized the stark divide between his life and the one his mother had endured. Every corner seemed to whisper her struggle. He imagined her walking these streets, working long hours for pennies, sleeping under bridges when rent failed. He thought of the endless speeches about merit and hard work, and how cruelly those words mocked people like Amara. Poverty was not failure, it was a sentence society imposed. His empire, built on technology and privilege, felt powerless against the raw wound of inequality. For the first time, Daniel wasn't looking down from wealth. He was looking across the gulf, realizing his mother had been swallowed by it.
One evening, Jack returned with unsettling news. The first DNA test, the one that crushed Daniel's hope, may not have been entirely honest. A technician at the lab had recently come into sudden wealth, a promotion that didn't fit his record. Digging deeper, Jack discovered ties to one of Richard Foster's old associates, a man determined to keep Amara erased from the narrative. Someone had tampered with Daniel's search, bribing silence and falsifying results. The truth wasn't lost, it was buried. Daniel's fury grew cold, sharp. This was not just fate, it was manipulation. For decades, power had kept Amara invisible, but not anymore. He vowed the next test would be foolproof, protected from interference and undeniable. If the wealthy had worked this hard to silence her existence, then finding Amara was no longer personal, it was justice. Daniel realized the battle was larger than personal longing. It was about truth denied, justice delayed, and dignity stolen. The bribed DNA test proved that wealth wasn't just about privilege, it was about control, shaping stories, silencing inconvenient lives. If someone wanted to erase Amara, it meant she still lived, and her existence threatened carefully built lies. For Daniel, this was no longer curiosity, it was identity. Blood cannot be rewritten, no matter how much money flows to bury it. Belonging cannot be bribed away. His search was no longer for comfort, but for confrontation. The past had been twisted to protect the Foster name. Now he would untwist it, no matter the cost. He stood in the mirror once more, but this time, the reflection didn't ask. It demanded, find her.
Some encounters are engineered, others arrive with divine timing. On an autumn afternoon, Daniel drove through the older part of the city, his supercar gliding between narrow streets. His thoughts wandered, replaying Amara's photograph in his mind. At an intersection, traffic slowed. Pedestrians streamed past, anonymous faces, until one wasn't. Across the street, a frail elderly woman shuffled under the weight of a sack nearly bigger than her frame. Her clothes were torn, her feet bare, her back bent from years of burden. But her eyes, those unmistakable eyes, pierced him like lightning. His chest constricted. He gripped the wheel, breathless, recognizing in her face the same quiet fire from the faded photograph. It wasn't wishful thinking. It was blood calling blood. Fate had led him through endless dead ends, only to place her in front of him when he least expected it. Traffic stopped. Horns blared, but the world shrank to a single moment. Daniel pulled over abruptly, his supercar gleaming beside a sidewalk that smelled of exhaust and dust. Onlookers glanced curiously, some raising phones, recording without context. The wealthy man in a designer suit moved with urgency, approaching a beggar forgotten by the world. To the crowd, it was a spectacle, money kneeling before poverty. To Daniel, it was eternity folding in on itself. Years of searching, documents, lies, sleepless nights, all converged into the fragile figure before him. She looked up, startled, her sack slipping from her weary shoulders. Recognition wasn't polite or gradual. It struck violently, as though history itself had slammed into the present. In that instant, the contrast was undeniable. Billions in net worth bent before rags, two halves of one life colliding on a dirty street corner.
Recognition lives deeper than evidence. Daniel's soul surged with certainty, as though 1,000 mirrors had finally aligned. The lines on her face, carved by hardship, carried echoes of his own. Her eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, shone with the same shape that had stared back at him in every reflection since childhood. He didn't need confirmation from laboratories or notarized files. The connection was visceral, undeniable. She studied him too, confusion warring with a flicker of something buried for decades, a memory of a child once cradled. Around them, strangers captured the scene, but no lens could translate its depth. What society dismissed as spectacle was, in truth, blood calling to blood, grief recognizing grief, love reclaiming its claim. No adoption file, no lie, no bribe could sever what had always remained alive, waiting to surface in this single breath. The years between them didn't vanish, they collapsed with crushing weight. Daniel felt the ache of birthdays celebrated under false pretenses, successes shadowed by emptiness, and questions met with silence. Amara carried heavier years, nights spent alone, forced labor for pennies, hunger sharp as knives, grief over a child she believed lost forever. Every struggle she endured now connected directly to his life of privilege. They had walked two separate roads paved with opposite stones, one with abundance, the other with absence. Yet here they were, both trembling, both undone by the sheer magnitude of reunion. The city continued its pace around them, indifferent to the collapse of time occurring in its midst. But for Daniel and Amara, this was eternity condensed. The years didn't simply vanish. They testified, demanding recognition of every sacrifice, every injustice, every stolen moment, finally reclaimed.
Within hours, the internet had a new obsession. Videos flooded feeds. A billionaire kneeling before a ragged woman. Images framed for clicks rather than context. Headlines competed for attention. Fortune meets poverty. Billionaire's mystery street encounter. Speculation ran wild. Some praised, some mocked, most consumed. For Daniel, none of it mattered. Cameras distorted meaning, but truth pulsed in his veins. This wasn't a scandal or publicity stunt. This was family colliding after decades of silence. Still, the noise was relentless, infiltrating boardrooms, gossip columns, and investor calls. The spectacle was now public property, and every analyst demanded answers. But Daniel knew that this was no stage performance. This was blood reclaiming its rightful place. Let the headlines laugh or question. He had found what mattered, and he would not let the world rewrite this moment into anything less than destiny. Amara had learned survival by rejecting pity. To her, assistance often came coded in judgment, a reminder of inferiority she refused to accept. Even now, when fortune reached out with genuine hands, she recoiled. The mansion Daniel offered was not a home to her. It was an alien world of polished stone and wide staircases that mocked her worn shoes. She whispered in her heart that she was nothing, unworthy, a burden. Years of invisibility had taught her to remain small, unseen, safe in shadows. Daniel's insistence frightened her, not because it lacked sincerity, but because it threatened to strip away the armor she had worn for survival. She hesitated, trembling at the thought of belonging again, wondering if dignity could truly exist beside opulence. Her instinct was to retreat, yet in her son's presence, resistance trembled on the edge of surrender.
The gates of Daniel's mansion opened, swallowing Amara into a world she had never imagined for herself. Chandeliers glimmered like constellations above marble floors polished to a perfect shine. The air smelled of fresh flowers, the kind she had only admired from sidewalks outside expensive shops. She hesitated at every step, afraid her worn shoes might stain the rugs worth more than her lifetime of earnings. Servants paused, unsure how to greet her, their rehearsed professionalism colliding with raw humanity. For Amara, it was overwhelming, almost offensive. So much abundance when she had scraped for every meal. Yet in the midst of grandeur, Daniel guided her not with orders, but with quiet gestures of care. For the first time in decades, she sat in a chair built for comfort, not endurance. The mansion wasn't yet home, but it was no longer just his. The reunion exploded into headlines. News outlets plastered Amara's image beside Daniel's polished profile. Tabloids mocked her appearance, labeling her Billionaire's beggar mom, while business journals speculated on his judgment. Investors panicked, analysts declared instability, and rivals saw opportunity. To the public, it was entertainment, a morality play where wealth bent to poverty. To Daniel, it was personal. He ignored the mockery, but he couldn't ignore the pressure from his board, who demanded distance and discretion. But every attack only deepened his resolve. Wealth without truth was hollow, and reputation without integrity was worthless. If protecting his mother cost him deals, he would pay. Fortune had always been transactional, but love was priceless. Daniel knew the world saw scandal. He saw salvation. The frenzy could roar. It would not change what mattered. For the first time, he had something money couldn't buy.
Catherine appeared quietly, carrying the weight of years she could no longer contain. Her elegance remained, but her eyes betrayed storms long restrained. She confessed, not with words to the world, but in the silent cracks of her demeanor, that she had known more than she let on. She had lived with the truth, but feared Richard's wrath more than Daniel's longing. Love had been present, but chained by obedience. Now, faced with Amara's fragile dignity, Catherine's silence felt like betrayal. Yet her presence was not hostile. She offered something unexpected, a fragile bridge. In Amara, she saw the strength she herself lacked. In Catherine, Amara saw the privilege denied her. Between them stood Daniel, product of both love and suppression. The moment was heavy, but healing often begins when guilt stops hiding. Catherine's silence ended, and with it, part of Daniel's ache. The backlash reached its peak. Boardrooms whispered betrayal, investors demanded explanations, and columnists dissected Daniel's choices as if humanity were a liability. His empire, once untouchable, now trembled under pressure. Yet Daniel stood firm. He refused to release statements drafted by lawyers or spin narratives written by strategists. He knew the world wanted him to choose, fortune or family. For Daniel, there was no choice at all. His wealth had never filled the void. Why defend it at the cost of the one truth he had searched for his entire life? Backlash clarified where loyalty ended and love began. The world could threaten losses, but it had no power over what mattered most. In the storm of criticism, Daniel found clarity. He had gained the one thing money couldn't manipulate. That, he realized, was real fortune.
Days grew into patterns that stitched healing into routine. Mornings began with warm tea shared on balconies overlooking the city. Evenings closed with quiet stories exchanged beside the fire. Daniel learned his mother's rhythms, the foods she preferred, the silences she carried, the humor she let slip when safe. Amara, once hardened by survival, softened into someone who could rest. Their bond wasn't instant perfection. It was fragile, marked by caution and years they could never recover. Yet in each moment of presence, trust grew. Daniel listened without pressing. Amara shared without shame. Slowly, the mansion became less alien, less overwhelming. It was no longer a palace of distance. It was a shelter of connection. In fragile steps, mother and son learned how to coexist, not as strangers bound by blood, but as family, relearning the meaning of home.
Amara carried decades of scars etched deeper than skin. She remembered sleeping under bridges, nights where hunger gnawed her ribs until dawn, jobs where exhaustion was her only wage. She recalled landlords who raised rent without mercy, foremen who dismissed her dignity, and winters that froze her bones. Meanwhile, Daniel remembered his own childhood of abundance, chauffeurs waiting by warm cars, tutors drilling him in marble halls, holidays layered with gifts. Side by side, their flashbacks collided like two films played on one screen, the contrast brutal and undeniable. Poverty had nearly erased her, while privilege had insulated him from her suffering. Yet instead of guilt alone, Daniel felt responsibility. Her endurance had been his inheritance. He vowed that wealth would no longer be distance. It would be the tool to restore her dignity, a bridge across decades of injustice.
One evening, as laughter began to stitch into their routine, Amara collapsed. Panic erupted. Sirens filled the night as Daniel rode beside her stretcher, his heart gripped by fear. In the sterile brightness of the hospital, time stretched mercilessly. Wealth couldn't speed the clock, nor could it buy certainty. Doctors worked with calm precision, but the weight of mortality pressed down like stone. Daniel realized he had found her, only to face the cruel chance of losing her again. Minutes dragged into hours before a doctor emerged, his words measured, careful. Amara would live, but her body carried years of struggle. Daniel exhaled for the first time in hours. The scare etched itself deep. Love wasn't a guarantee. It was fragile, fleeting, and precious. If fate had given them this second chance, he vowed he would never waste it again. Recovery demanded patience, and Daniel gave it freely. He learned her medications by heart, memorized every doctor's instruction, and spent nights in hospital chairs rather than boardroom suites. When she returned home, he dismissed unnecessary staff, ensuring her dignity wasn't drowned in performance. Instead, he offered simple comforts, a chair adjusted to her liking, meals that reminded her of her past, conversations that required no masks. Amara, once hardened by the fight to survive, allowed herself to rest in his care. For Daniel, tending to her was redemption, a chance to repay decades of absence. Wealth had built palaces, but here it built healing. Love transformed from abstract yearning into daily devotion. This was not charity, it was restoration. The son who had been raised in cold abundance was finally giving warmth back to the mother who had given him life.
Daniel decided to face the world directly. Cameras flashed as he stood before microphones, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a son. His voice carried steady conviction as he declared the truth. The woman once dismissed as a beggar was his mother, his origin, his blood. He rejected the notion that compassion weakened business. He named the injustice that had robbed her of her child, exposing the machinery that had buried her existence for decades. If investors saw weakness, let them. If headlines mocked, let them. He would not trade his mother's dignity for shareholders' approval. For the first time, Daniel's empire was not defended by secrecy or calculation, but by truth, spoken without apology. The world expected him to bow to optics. Instead, he raised his voice for love, knowing that real power was found in honesty. One evening, the dining room became a place of fragile reconciliation. Catherine arrived, quiet and hesitant, carrying years of guilt. Amara sat across from her, dignity restored, but scars still visible. Between them was Daniel, the bridge, the son who belonged to both women in different ways. The meal was simple, but the silence was heavy. Slowly, words emerged. Catherine admitted regret. Amara spoke of survival. And Daniel listened, holding the weight of two mothers' truths. It wasn't perfect. There was no instant forgiveness. But in that moment, something shifted. The divide between privilege and poverty, silence and sacrifice began to heal. The table was no longer just a place to eat. It was a place to rewrite history, not with erasure, but with recognition. Healing didn't roar, it whispered. And that night, it whispered the beginning of peace.
Daniel's world demanded decisions. His board wanted him to step away from Amara to preserve reputation. Investors whispered of instability. Markets punished his defiance. Yet as he weighed billions against blood, the answer was already clear. Success built on lies was no success at all. Legacy without love was a hollow shell. His fortune could be rebuilt, lost, or multiplied. It no longer mattered. What mattered was the fragile, powerful bond restored between mother and son. Choosing her was not just rebellion against the world's judgment, it was redemption for years stolen from them both. Daniel no longer chased the approval of markets or men. He had finally found the truth of who he was, and in that truth, there was no room for compromise. His choice was final, and it was love. The mansion, once cold and echoing, now glowed with warmth. Nights ended with laughter by the fire. Mornings began with shared meals instead of loneliness. Amara no longer slept on sidewalks. She rested in a home where she was cherished. Daniel, once haunted by mirrors, now faced his reflection without fear. The eyes staring back no longer asked questions. They carried answers, history, and belonging. The years they had lost could never be returned, but the years ahead were theirs to claim. Wealth had once been Daniel's shield. Now it was his tool to restore dignity, to rebuild family, to honor sacrifice. The story of a boy told he was unwanted had ended. In its place stood a man who found the truth, that love, once buried, will always rise. And in that rising, both rich and poor were finally healed.